Hello everyone, I'm Brian Easton, the author of the Autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter series. This is Fruit Brute, and this is Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter. Welcome to the Werewolf Bar, everyone, and our October episode of Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter. We have got a monster of a show for you this evening, with contributions from more good folks than I think we've ever had on one show before. And I'm excited to bring it to you in honor of spooky season, as it seems to have become known these days. We've just got loads of stuff to cover tonight, and lots of guests to introduce, but in accordance with prescribed ritual of the show, we must begin with our creature of the night. Now, it was this very time last year that I decided that this single malt Irish whiskey would be the official Halloween creature of the night. Let me reintroduce it to you. The Sexton, not only a product of the land of Ireland, from where we got Samhain, or Samhain as it's spelled, but also classically and elegantly bottled and designed to capture the very spirit of the holiday. Note the hexagon-shaped glass bottle. It's got the embossed skeleton head on the top and some very nice, neatly styled gold lettering. In fact, I just saw that the Sexton has a commemorative bottle out to celebrate the final season of The Walking Dead. So apparently we are not the only ones who appreciate the character of this whiskey. But I wouldn't have made the Sextant the official spirit of Halloween, the creature of the night, based on pure affectation. I mean, we all know that good presentation doesn't mean that what's inside is worth a damn. But I can assure you, in the Sexton's case, the two are perfectly aligned. So certainly, this is an Irish whiskey, but it's also made from 100% Irish malted barley, making it a single malt. And it's triple distilled in copper pot stills, which is probably the same way my great-granddaddy made shine. Then it's aged to maturity in an old sherry casks made of European oak. So, Ina Huna Hauna Guiv, which is my attempt in Irish Gaelic to wish you a happy Halloween. Again, a smooth, rich flavor of dried fruit, and to me, a little cinnamon. And I wouldn't call this pour a sacred experience, but there is something meaningful about the creature this time of year, at least to me. And speaking of meaningful experiences, I want to share with you a little something that I picked up a few weeks ago. As I have told you earlier in other episodes of Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter, I had tried for years to cast my own silver bullets, or one single silver bullet. I can't tell you how much silver got butchered in those attempts and how many times I was burned. But suffice it to say, melting silver and pouring it into a 45 bullet mold is quite a bit easier written about than done, especially when you don't have really the proper equipment. I mean, the stuff doesn't even melt to like 1700 degrees. I did manage finally to get one decent silver projectile out of it before the mold was completely ruined. And I still have it as a pendant somewhere. But because of my smithing and reloading skills were amateur at best, I never really had what I considered to be a true functional silver bullet. That is until now. Have a look at this. So here we have a box from Minuteman Ammunition, the Werewolf Defense Line. And I can see on the box, I like how they included that just in case. So it comes in a box like this. Do a little unboxing video here. And it comes in another box. Here, we'll take it out. They call this their coffin. And as you can see, it's laser etched with the Werewolf Defense Line logo. And then when we open it up, there's our silver bullet. Now, I bought 3 of these initially, and I'm waiting for them to restock so I can buy an additional 3, because I had made for them this little brown bullet box, which is sealed with magnets and is pretty strong. But you can see inside we have a place for 6 silver bullets. This is what they look like. These are 45 long Colt. The projectiles are turned from a silver rod and then put into these nickel-plated brass starline casings. And I'm very impressed with them. And according to their ballistic research, these perform about as well or about to par with pure copper projectiles. Now they're not cheap. Each one of these will set you back about $150, but it does come in that real nice box. I won't be storing mine in that, of course, because I have a few of them, and I'm going to use them, store them in this little deal, which I had made for me from a guy on Etsy. And it just snaps right together with that magnet, and if I want to display them, I take the top off. Otherwise, they keep safe right like that. So that's the Werewolf Defense Line from Minuteman Ammunition. And they have all the popular cartridge sizes: 45 automatic Colt, 9mm, 357 Magnum, and on down the line. I didn't see any rifle cartridges yet. Mostly these are for pistols, but I don't know. Stay tuned. They may have them yet. So special thanks to Minuteman Ammunition and the Werewolf Defense Line for providing me with some actual functional, fireable silver bullets. As far as I've been able to discover, and believe me, I have done the due diligence, Minuteman is the only outfit out there actively manufacturing this kind of ammunition. So you might imagine that I was quite excited to have found the Werewolf Defense Line, whose silver bullets are 99.9% pure, by the way, and I have seen the assay. Oh, you can buy bullet-shaped silver or silver bullion in the shape of cartridges all day long, but they're not live ammo. They're just statues of ammo. And I guess you could cut them up for shot or something to use in a shotgun. I mean, they are silver after all. I mean, if you're clever enough, just about anything made from silver could be potentially weaponized against a werewolf. And Tex Grebner is about to show you what I mean. Here is your October edition of Tools of the Trade.
Welcome to Tools of the Trade here on Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter. I am Tex Grebner. Happy Halloween, everyone. Now, Brian wanted me to do this with a pumpkin, but I have a lot of pride in my marksmanship, and a pumpkin's too big a target. Also, I'm a cheap bastard, so drawing a jack-o'-lantern face on a clay pigeon just seemed really on brand for me. There's a pretty famous line in the Kevin Costner Robin Hood: "I will cut your heart out with a spoon." And of course, "that's not a knife, this is a knife," and it's a spoon on The Simpsons. What, you've never played Knifey Spoony before? Well, I'm about to make a stabby spoon on this episode of Tools of the Trade. So if you've read the Legends of the Werewolf Hunter anthology, you might remember the character of Silver Arrow, which is in the story Freak Show that I had the pleasure and nightmare of actually writing. Now, Silver Arrow is a traumatized young man that grows up into a highly functional alcoholic with a revenge mission. And I feel very conflicted about the story that I wrote because it was something that I felt would give me nightmares. But I guess that's how you know you're doing it right, if you finish a chapter and you feel like you're going to hell for writing the villains how you did. However, this is a spoon arrow. Now, on the American frontier, spoons were highly prized, even if they were not silver, because when natives and white settlers or whoever happened to be colonizing the land clashed during raids, the natives loved spoons because they were very easy to convert into very functional arrowheads. So I'm going to take you back in time, and I'm going to show you not only how I made this, which this is not silver, it's only Dollar General mild steel, but I'm going to show you how I made this and explain, in my opinion, scholarly, why precious metals are actually so valuable in the human condition. Since about 30,000 years ago, we've been using malleable metals as striking tools to aid in flint knapping during the Stone Age. About 12,000 years ago, on the other hand, the Chalcolithic Age started, where people started striking stones against these malleable metals like copper, silver, and gold in order to actually make tools and projectile points and weapons, which is why we have the concept of precious metals, because these metals could be worked with Stone Age technology. Now, this is not razor sharp. It just has a wicked point. But honestly, it doesn't necessarily need to be a razor sharp broadhead. Also, what would work even better for this, and something that Winter Fox would definitely encounter during World War I when he's over in Europe, is an absinthe spoon. Because an absinthe spoon has holes in it which would make hafting it much easier, and an absinthe spoon is already flat to hold the sugar. So hafting it would be much easier with a silver absinthe spoon. Now, you could also do as my character did in the story of Freak Show, which was just take a hacksaw to silver bullion rounds, meaning spot silver, and make arrowheads that way. Because silver doesn't take an edge very well, but it definitely does make a glorified shiv. And I don't think anybody would volunteer to stand in front of this. Now, this is a 60-pound takedown recurve, and it's not necessarily analogous to what Silver Arrow had. He had a 60-pound bare glass-powered grizzly, so a one-piece bow, but still a modern recurve. Now, as I said, this is not edged, but it is wicked sharp. A whole bunch of buffalo went down to arrows just like this from the time of colonization until there really weren't any buffalo to be had anymore. And a whole bunch of cavalry soldiers took this in the guts. So, have no fear. This is, as it is right now, a legitimate weapon. Also, I admit I didn't use pine pitch. I used JB Weld. Silver Arrow comes in a time between Michael Winter Fox and Sylvester James. He's not directly connected to the Winter Fox line. He's kind of second-hand connected through a medicine man that mentored him that was the apprentice of the medicine man that was part of the Rosebud Massacre in Winter Fox Book 1. Now, I would argue that silver bullets are the gold standard, but they are a metallurgic and ballistic nightmare to do right. So he wouldn't have had the know-how of Michael Winterfox because he'd never met the man. However, silver arrows are a much more low-key, quieter, and you can make them a lot easier without people asking questions that are going to get you locked in a psych ward than going to a gunsmith and asking for silver bullets. It is, however, not quite as efficient as pulling a trigger. So because anything we're doing is worth doing with style, we're going to try and put an arrow through that eye socket on that Spirit Halloween wolf mask. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this episode of Tools of the Trade.
Tex actually pitched me the idea of Michael Winterfox making arrowheads from silver spoons a while back, and I am proud to say that I did use it in the second Winterfox journal. Just a small spoiler there. He was also thoughtful enough to actually send me the arrow that he uses in this month's segment. Here is what used to be a spoon, now transformed into a point, lethal in the right hands, as we have seen. I want to thank Tex for taking the time to make the video, first of all, and to demonstrate its use, and then finally for sending the arrow to me as a souvenir. Tex has an abundance of information on all types of weaponry, from spears to firearms, but his YouTube channel, as noted on the bumper at the end of his segment, is largely concerned with archery. Take a look at this clip he sent me. You may want to back that up and watch that again, because that is an impressive shot. The way he just snipes that clay pigeon right out of the air before it hits the ground. So if we read Legends of the Werewolf Hunter, the anthology, and Tex's story, Freak Show, which is in it, I think we can better appreciate the character of Silver Arrow and the personal accomplishments written into him. So thanks again to Tex. Well, as you know, my Autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter series consists of 4 books, the original trilogy and the first volume of the Winterfox journals, each of which is available as an audiobook as narrated by Basil Sands. Now, Basil does such an excellent job at handling the many accents, foreign words, and voices that are in my novels, and I consider myself fortunate to have him as their narrator. Basil also contributed to the Legends of the Werewolf Hunter anthology with his story, Eternal Hunter. So I asked him if he had anything that he would like to share with us for the Halloween season, and he did not disappoint. And so, without further introduction, here's Basil Sands with a narration exclusively for Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter on HP Lovecraft's The Terrible Old Man.
The Terrible Old Man, a story by HP Lovecraft, originally published in 1921. It was the design of Angelo Ricci and Joe Janek and Manuel Silva to call on the terrible old man. This old man dwells all alone in a very ancient house on Water Street, near the sea. He is reputed to be both exceedingly rich and exceedingly feeble, which forms a situation very attractive to men of the profession of Messrs. Ricci, Janek, and Silva, for that profession was nothing less dignified than robbery. The inhabitants of Kingsport say and think many things about the terrible old man, which generally keep him safe from the attention of gentlemen like Mr. Ricci and his colleagues, despite the almost certain fact that he hides a fortune of indefinite magnitude somewhere about his musty and venerable abode. He is, in truth, a very strange person, believed to have been a captain of East India clipper ships in his day, so old that no one can remember when he was young, and so taciturn that few know his real name. Among the gnarled trees in the front yard of his aged and neglected place, he maintains a strange collection of large stones, oddly grouped and painted, so that they resemble the idols in some obscure Eastern temple. This collection frightens away most of the small boys who love to taunt the terrible old man about his long white hair and long white beard, or to break the small-paned windows of his dwelling with wicked missiles. There are other things which frighten the older and more curious folks who sometimes steal up to the house to peer in through the dusty panes. Those folks say that on a table in a bare room on the ground floor are many peculiar bottles. In each, a small piece of lead suspended pendulum-wise from a string. And they say that the terrible old man talks to these bottles, addressing them by such names as Jack, Scarface, Long Tom, Spanish Joe, Peters, and Mate Ellis, and that whenever he speaks to a bottle, the little lead pendulum within makes certain definite vibrations, as if an answer. Those who have watched the tall, lean, terrible old man in these peculiar conversations do not watch him again. But Angelo Ricci and Joe Chanek and Manuel Silva were not of Kingsport blood. They were of that new and heterogeneous alien stock which lies outside the charmed circle of New England life and traditions, and they saw in the terrible old man merely a tottering, almost helpless graybeard, who could not walk without the aid of his knotted cane, and whose thin, weak hands shook pitifully. They were really quite sorry in their way for the lonely, unpopular old fellow whom everybody shunned and at whom all the dogs barked singularly. But business is business, and to a robber whose soul is in his profession, there is a lure and a challenge about a very old and very feeble man who has no account at the bank and who pays for his few necessities at the village store with Spanish gold and silver minted 2 centuries ago. Messrs. Ricci, Janek, and Silva selected the night of April 11th for their call. Mr. Ricci and Mr. Silva were to interview the poor old gentleman, whilst Mr. Janek waited for them in their presumable metallic burden with a covered motor car in Ship Street, by the gate in the tall rear wall of their host's grounds. Desire to avoid needless explanation in case of unexpected police intrusions prompted these plans for a quiet and unostentatious departure. As prearranged, the 3 adventurers started out separately in order to prevent any evil-minded suspicions afterward. Messrs. Ricci and Silva met in Water Street by the old man's front gate, and although they did not like the way the moon shone down upon the painted stones through the budding branches of the gnarled trees, they had more important things to think about than mere idle superstition. They feared it might be unpleasant work making the terrible old man loquacious concerning his hoarded gold and silver, for aged sea captains are notably stubborn and perverse. Still, he was very old and very feeble, and there were 2 visitors. Messrs. Ricci and Silva were experienced in the art of making unwilling persons voluble. And the screams of a weak and exceptionally venerable man can be easily muffled. So they moved up to the one-lighted window and heard the terrible old man talking childishly to his bottles with pendulums. They donned masks and knocked politely at the weather-stained oaken door. Waiting seemed very long to Mr. Chanak as he fidgeted restlessly in the covered motor car by the terrible old man's gate in Ship Street. He was more than ordinarily tender-hearted, and he did not like the hideous screams he had heard in the ancient house just after the hour appointed for the deed. Had he not told his colleagues to be as gentle as possible with the pathetic old sea captain? Very nervously he watched that narrow oaken gate and the high and ivy-clad stone wall. Frequently he consulted his watch and wondered at the delay. Had the old man died before revealing where his treasure was hidden? And had a thorough search become necessary? Mr. Chanak did not like to wait so long in the dark in such a place. Then he sensed a soft tread or tapping on the walk inside the gate, heard a gentle fumbling at the rusty latch, and saw the narrow, heavy door swing inward. And in the pallid glow of the single dim street lamp, he strained his eyes to see what his colleagues had brought out of that sinister house which loomed so close behind. But when he looked, he did not see what he had expected. For his colleagues were not there at all, but emerging from the shadow was the terrible old man, leaning quietly on his knotted cane and smiling hideously. Mr. Chanak had never before noticed the color of that man's eyes. Now he saw that they were yellow. Little things make considerable excitement in little towns, which is the reason that Kingsport people talked all that spring and summer about the 3 unidentifiable bodies which the tide washed in, horribly slashed as if with many cutlasses, and horribly mangled as if by the tread of many cruel boot heels. And some people even spoke of things as trivial as the deserted motor car found in Ship Street, or certain especially inhuman cries, probably of a stray animal or migratory bird, heard in the night by wakeful citizens. But in this idle village gossip the terrible old man took no interest at all. He was, by nature, reserved, and when one is aged and feeble, one's reserve is doubly strong. Besides, so ancient a sea captain must have witnessed scores of things much more stirring in the far-off days of his unremembered youth. This has been The Terrible Old Man by HP Lovecraft, and I'm Basil Sands.
Well, that was nice. The man has the chops of a narrator and a voice actor, and I really loved his use of sound effects in this one. Thank you, Basil, for putting that together and for sharing your talent and time with us. If you want to hear more from Basil, just go to YouTube and enter Basil Sands, that's B-A-S-I-L, Sands, into the search bar. That'll give you links to his Audible audiobooks, his own slate of novels, as well as his personal YouTube channel. So if you're like me and you grew up with comic books, you might be familiar with Marvel Comics' Werewolf by Night from the 1970s. And if you're a fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and or a subscriber to Disney Plus, then you're probably aware that they dropped their first Halloween special about a week ago, featuring the titular werewolf by night, aka Jack Russell. It also debuted the Man-Thing. Yes, the swamp creature with the unfortunate double entendre of a name has always been one of my favorite characters. Anyway, it would be remiss of me on this show not to recognize the Werewolf by Night Halloween special, especially since not only have I been looking forward to the MCU unveiling their monsters for many years now, but the character of Jack Russell was my very first introduction to a werewolf of any kind. I had the old Power Records read-along comic with the 45 LP, which of course, as I had mentioned before, my father confiscated and subsequently launched my interest into werewolfery. They rebranded that one the Curse of the Werewolf, but it's the same character, it's Jack Russell, and even though it would be years before I realized the joke built into that name. Anyway, the Werewolf by Night Halloween special was a blast as far as I'm concerned. I love the way they paid homage to the classic black and white monster films of the 30s and 40s, first of all, and how they incorporated Ulysses Bloodstone and Ted Sallis, aka the Man-Thing, into the process. I thought the premise was clever and yet fitting for Halloween. And I was glad to see that they didn't pull any punches when it came to the violence and gore, which is interesting because I found out that they got away with all that because it wasn't red. Because it's in black and white, they could do all kinds of things they couldn't have done if it had it been in color. So yeah, that was interesting to note. I especially enjoyed the fight scenes and the fright scenes, and I absolutely loved the way the Man-Thing looked, especially at the end when they showed him in color. They made him a little goofier than I would have liked, kind of like Groot's marshland cousin or something. Within the comics, he's barely a sentient creature, basically runs on pure empathy and feelings for emotions. Still, whatever knows fear burns at the Man-Thing's touch, and they did that part very well. I confess I wasn't a big fan of the way the werewolf looked. They seemed like they could have done a little bit more with his face. I mean, I appreciated that they didn't go full howling werewolf with him. They kept it old school, you know, Lon Chaney Jr. and Oliver Reed type of werewolf. And that's where my criticism ends, because they made him a force to be reckoned with, very powerful and savage with some great moves. And I admit that going in, I thought the guys with the body armor and the shock poles were going to be from the TVA. But apparently they were just monster control on the Bloodstone payroll. So all things considered, I thought it was an awesome, and I've watched it a few different times now. So since we're on the topic of the MCU, some of you might be familiar with the comic book run and now the Disney Plus animated series, What If? Which, if you don't know, poses a particular question, what if, as applied to a number of different characters and continuities within the Marvel Universe. Or multiverse, I guess would be the better term. It merely asks us to consider how things might be different if other choices had been made, or if certain events had never transpired, etc., etc. Well, in keeping with this convention, and especially for our Halloween episode, Amanda Rogers has taken a page from Marvel and turned it into Amanda Asks What If. This is cool. Check it out.
I come to you this evening, not as a wanderer in the outer darkness, seeking enlightenment, but as your mystic guide to the shadow world that lies beside our own, where we will answer the question, what if? What if, in another time, in another world, beyond the shadow veil that we cannot see through, Abigail James passed the contagion of the werewolf to Sylvester moments after birth? I see Abigail, running desperately to save her own wolfish hide, abandoning her baby to be raised by his father and grandfather. Michael Winterfox, holding a vendetta against the werewolves from many years before, at first thinks the child infected by the beast must be eliminated. But his own grandchild, his flesh and blood, can he do it? I don't think. I think together the two men raise Sylvester the Wolf to hate his own kind. They train him in combat, reminding him always that only his human side can control his bestial form. Sylvester goes off to hunt his fanged brethren and becomes known not as the woodsman, but as Fenrir, the beginning of all Ragnarok. The werewolves die, piece by piece, bit by bit, and in doing so he gathers to him the soul of Tyrion, until he becomes the most powerful wolf that the lineage has ever seen. And in time, would he too take down the head of all werewolves? What if? In a different Elseworld, perhaps Sylvester died instead of his father that night when his mother came back for them. Perhaps Winterfox, seeing that he is the very last of his line, takes on the role of huntsman himself and goes on a werewolf-killing spree that drenches the world in the blood of the wolf. Look into the crystal ball. See what worlds you can see.
Isn't that an interesting what-if question? And my first reaction is to say I think Amanda is absolutely correct in the fact that Michael Winterfox would not have killed a young, bitten Sylvester, since he revealed in a Heart of Scars that he no longer had the stomach to kill his own. What also comes to mind right away with that question is the paradigm with which the wolves in my universe operate. Meaning, if the events are that different, then maybe so are the rules. For instance, if we apply the same rules to the lineage, in this alternate reality where Foster James is alive and Sylvester is raised as a werewolf by both he and Michael, then despite their best efforts, I've got to think that I would write it to where eventually the beast would completely dominate SLJ, and then he would kill them both. Then he can go on and declare war on the lineage as Fenrir, another kinslayer, perhaps right-hand man to Alaric, as he not only culls the universal pack, but eventually fights with the firstborn to destroy it. The dynamics there could get really interesting. Of course, there'd have to be some kind of plot device in place where it's even possible for Fenrir to harm Alaric, because remember, we're going by how the rules work as we know them. But if we change it up completely and invent an entirely new paradigm, then we can make it turn out however we like. And maybe the three of them turn into a werewolf vigilante committee. We have Michael Winterfox, the seasoned werewolf hunter, Foster James, the hardened and bitter widower, raising a son that is everything that he has come to hate, and Sylvester, of course, aka Fenrir, and all three of them versus the lineage. They would, of course, find allies in the likes of Thies the Livonian, the Hound of God, perhaps the fool wolf Kunbish, maybe even the rest of those who tried to kill Alaric and failed. The possibilities come thick and fast, and the whole idea is appealing. And maybe in some other timeline, there is another version of me who has written this very story, and right now he's working on his 5th novel. So thanks, Amanda. What a great premise. Enjoyed your costume and the effects as well. If you've got a question for the show, be sure to send it to Amanda at this email address. Well, certainly no Halloween edition of this show would be complete without Dr. Prasard's expertise in the occult arts and sciences. Doc has taken us through the different cultural and magical traditions of shape-changing over a period of several months, and we wrapped up that phase of things a couple of shows back. So tonight is a fitting opportunity for Doc to begin a new chapter in Doc Talk Shop, one which will explore the world of discarnate entities, ghosts, spirits, demons, wraiths, poltergeist, and the list goes on. Western culture inclined to lump all these beings into one category and call them a ghost or a spirit. But Doc's going to show us how this couldn't be farther from the truth. And since All Hallows Eve is traditionally when the veil between our world and the unseen is the most permeable, there's not a better time to kick off this phase. Here's Doc Talk Shop with Dr. T. Broussard.
Welcome to Doc Talk Shop. Tonight I will be discussing the differences between demons, spirits, and ghosts as the beginning of a new series. We'll begin with ghosts, spirits. To begin with, humans can typically be divided into body, soul, and spirit. The spirit is the eternal part that comes from the source, however the individual defines it, and goes back to the source after death. The soul is the memory, if you will, of a given incarnation, so that one may die and go back to the source as a spirit, but still produce a ghost, because a ghost is a memory. The soul manifests with blood, binds the spirit to the body. Souls are what become ghosts. Ghosts can be divided into their more normal aspect, which only lasts from 3 to 9 days, and then they process back into the universe. Or they can become wraiths or specters and be bound to places, people, or things, and cause what's known as a haunting. If a ghost persists as a wraith or specter long enough, it can be demonized and become even more of a problem. These demonized ghosts are some of your more famous types of hauntings. These are your permanent hauntings. Now, besides ghosts of people, events have their ghosts. They get trapped in places, and in that case, they have what are called haunts. And haunts are literally a memory of an event happened in a place which, under the right conditions, are replayed by that place, like a film on a loop. Sensitive people can be drawn into a haunt and become witness to that event. Now, other cultures divide the body and spirit and so forth other ways, but typically it's always in multiples of 3. So we're going to stick with that basic breakdown of body, soul, and spirit. If you want to get fancy about it, that information is out there. But for our purposes, we'll stick with 3. Now, moving on. Other types of spirits include nature spirits, such as fae, elves, sprites, elemental spirits connected to 4 elements, and other natural phenomena that are personified and anthropomorphized with various levels of power. You know, there are the kind of elementals that people with the right knowledge can evoke and control for a bountiful harvest and so forth, or wipe out crops on the opposite end of the spectrum. And then there are those nature spirits that people actually worship as deifications of nature itself, such as a lunar goddess, a solar god, or a goddess of night, and the horn god, and other conceptions. Now, beside the human type of spirit and the nature spirit, there are those spirits that begin as one type of spirit, and for whatever reason go against their nature. They go outside of their programming, so to speak. They become cancerous to the very universe that they're part of. They are not simply malignant or violent as nature can be, but they become a disease in a sense. And these types of entities are what we call demons, from the Greek daemon. But when said as demon, it refers specifically to a spirit that has gone AWOL, it's gone off the reservation. And these belong to many cultures. They're not Judeo-Christian limited at all. Pretty much every culture on earth recognizes that there are spirits that have in some way violated their purview. Demons, because of their nature, they exist outside of finite nature. They exist just outside of carnal nature. They have a great deal of knowledge, and being non-linear, they have power, but they don't have very much authority. That's why it's common for magicians of both the right-hand path and the left-hand path to make use of demons. Demons, for all of their risks, which we'll get to in a moment, are easy to control if you know how and you take precautions. In modern day practice, the problem with a lot of people is they have the knowledge, but they don't always take precautions because they think, oh, this can't hurt me, or I am too powerful for this. So they end up leaving themselves vulnerable. And the other problem with the demonic entities is that many people, they start playing around with the ritual before they fully understand it. Before doing any kind of magic, any kind of ritual or spiritual practice at all, one should read the book or the text thoroughly and make sure one understands it. Otherwise, you might miss an important step that's left at the end of the notes on the ritual rather than in the beginning. Many of the old grimoires, many of the old spell books in the European tradition scatter the directions throughout the text. It's not only a neat little package. Part of learning the art of magic is learning how to read the text of magic. They don't just read like a step-by-step how-to recipe book. They are riddled with codes and ciphers and tests, because if you're not able to crack code, you're not worthy of working with the material. If you don't have the skills to decode the text, you don't have the right skills to do magic. A spellbook represents, in the European tradition at least, the notes of a practicing magician. In other words, if you got a hold of one, the author expected you to already know the base knowledge needed to make the magic work. In fact, it is said in initiated circles that one can learn everything one needs to know to be a magician in about a year. And given that year of study, if one lives 2 or 3 more years, one could effectively call oneself a magician. There are no super geniuses when it comes to magic, only effective or non-effective. And in all honesty and without hyperbole, an ineffective magician does not live very long. Because humans are tripartite, they have spirit, soul, and body. They partly exist in the same spectrum as ghosts and demons, as much as they do in the mundane sphere. In the mundane sphere, that part of a human being has to contend with the personifications of spirits that are in the mundane sphere, such as the spirits of the elements and things like that. So, just because there's sort of a barrier between the different realms doesn't mean one is exempt from spiritual interaction. You know, it's like this. I may not believe in the ocean, but if I step into it, I will feel the wet. Now, at this point, it's important to make a distinction between a demon and a devil. It is wrongly assumed that they're the same. They're not. Devils are the tormentors of demons. They are the jailers, demons are the prisoners. The devil in Christian theology is not the ruler of hell. He's its most infamous prisoner. That's why he's kept below every other demon. But like every prison on earth, Tartarus, which is the proper name for the abode of demons, at least in my understanding, has its own hierarchy. The Christian devil, or rather the being that most people confuse with the devil, is known as Hallel. It is the Hebrew Hallel, the angel of the morning star, that Christian writers labeled as Lucifer, which is a Latin title, meaning light bearer, that originally belonged to Prometheus. So many of these modern Luciferians who are misinformed as to their cosmotheology, they invoke the name of Lucifer without realizing that they are either invoking Prometheus or Hillel, and neither one is the figure of popular culture they're seeking. In the same sense, the title of Satan simply means adversary. So when you are adversarial to the things of the Jewish or Christian God, you are acting as a Satan. Yeah. And the Satan, the adversary, Hasatan, in both Christian and Jewish theology, would again be Hillel. But that's a bit much on the theology. Our matter here is these three types of spirits. Now, all that being said, below Hillel or above him, if you're looking at the hierarchy the way I do, with Hillel at the bottom, you have 5 other entities, which I'm not going to name, all of whom jockey for the position of the boss. They all want to be Hillel. They all think they're the devil. Tartarus as a dimension is always divided against itself. That's why it cannot stand. That's why it's easy for a magician or an exorcist to get authority over them, because they're like brutes. They have a lot of strength, but not much intellect. Or if they have intellect, they have the knowledge, but not the will or the understanding to apply it. Yeah, so this illustrates how incomplete demons are. They might have been complete at one time, but they became far lesser than what they could be or would have been. Now, as a quick side note, the Roman ritual of exorcism is essentially a banishing ritual such as a magician would use, but with the spiritual authority coming up from the exorcist, but from a religious organization, whether it's the Church of Rome or Protestant faith, what have you, so that the banishing comes not from the practitioner, but from the anointing of the deity, whoever that deity might be. It's interesting to note that one of the most famous books of magic in the world, The Key of Solomon, refers to the magician as the exorcist. This indicates at one point in time that banishing of demons, being an exorcist, and with being able to summon and control them. This is why a lot of people, they have this sort of a superstitious fear of Catholicism because of all the rituals and so forth. It is vastly important to understand that these beings on all levels, whether they be ghosts, whether they be spirits, whether they be demons, for all the power and knowledge they have, they are innately subject to the power and authority of human beings, because human beings, as I said, are tripartite. They have body, they have soul, and they have spirit. By adding those three, they also have a will. They have flesh, they have independence. They are a microcosm of the macrocosm. They are a miniature of the universe and the world in which they live. That gives them dominion over their portion of reality, and within that portion, they can boss the spirits around. So, the trick then is to develop your personal power, your will, by whatever tradition you see fit, so that if you encounter a spirit being, you can thus take authority over it, cast it out of your house, or command it to do what you need, or what have you. And as a plug for my business, if needed, you can hire me or someone like me to show you how to cast out a spirit if you have a problem, or to come over and cast it out for you. Part of what I do. It is my hope that you all enjoyed this introduction to spirits and so forth. And it is my hope that this series is enlightening to you all. And then I'll say thank you, good night, happy Halloween, and mind the moon.
One of my favorite aspects of the ghostly is what Doc talked about at the beginning there, the ghost of events replaying themselves over and over. Their memories, like he said. That's an often overlooked phenomenon as far as I'm concerned. And I come from an area where not far away there is a legend of a phantom funeral procession that has been moving down the streets of that town for over 100 years. The legend says that the first mayor of this town back in the early 1800s had been stabbed after a saloon brawl, and that he had been a man who was very well liked by everyone, apparently except by the stranger who killed him. So they had this grand funeral procession for him that led out to the rural cemetery, and he was laid to rest. But since that time, down into the next century, numerous eyewitnesses have come forward to bear witness to having seen this funeral procession on its way to the cemetery, coming right down the main drag. One other thing I'd like to point out from what Doc said pertains to the body and spirit of the werewolf. In the novels, many times parallels have been drawn between the spirit of the beast and the incarnation of the beast. And as we've seen, both Sylvester and Michael Winterfox are capable of leaving their bodies and entering the spirit world to meet the werewolf on those grounds. In the spirit world, or the other side, as they refer to it, are hunting grounds for the beast, just like the physical world. And we've seen wolves track both Sly and Michael across that plane. And they've returned the favor once or twice. It's one of the things that make Michael and Sylvester successful werewolf hunters. Their ability to read and decipher what's happening on the other side instead of just following tracks through a forest. So thank you, Doctor, for sharing with us tonight. We'll be looking forward to following the rest of the next stage of your series with great interest. We're going to switch gears now for an eldritch feast of sight and sound, a musical monster brought to us by Thom Brannan. Those of you who watch the show regularly will know Thom both from his songwriting performances of The Abyss Gazes Back and The Song of the Woodsman, as well as the story Salinger, which appeared in the Legends of the Werewolf Hunter anthology a year ago. Now, I've recently commissioned Thom to compose a complete soundtrack for my book series, which is going to be amazing, and I can't wait, and be sure you'll hear it right here when it's finished. But tonight he and some of his partners in crime have put together something called The Last King, which is inspired and based on The Repairer of Reputations, which is a short story published in 1895 by Robert W. Chambers in the collection The King in Yellow. It's kind of a metal music video that Thom has prepared for us tonight, complete with Lovecraftian overtones and imagery. a real sick bass line and lyrics that's perfect for this season. So crank up your speakers now and enjoy the ride with Thom Brannan and The Last King.
Praise and glory all for the pallid mask, 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 mask.
Creating anything musical has always been so far above my talents. I'm always impressed with folks who can pull off something like that. That chorus or refrain or whatever, I am the last king of, sounds like old Black Sabbath to me. And Thom had shared me several pieces that he had done before we arrived at this. And one of them was a score for Dracula, the novel that he had done. And I'd initially suggested he share some of that with us. But he chose the road less traveled, taking up the King in Yellow to create the most original audio-video combo I've ever seen. And like Thom told me, the muse wants what the muse wants. And it turned out fantastic. Many thanks and congrats to you, Thom, and the other fellows who kicked in as well. When I told you that we had a lot of content tonight, I wasn't kidding, because we're not done yet. I am very pleased to have Matthew Baugh with us this evening, scholar, author, and editor. Matthew wrote Stands in the Tombs for the Legends of the Werewolf Hunter anthology. Say, are we noticing a theme here? I reached out to him to see if he had anything that he'd like to share with us tonight, and he came back with something which couldn't be more apropos, a history of how an ancient pagan fire festival known as Samhain became the phenomenon we call Halloween. Ladies and gentlemen, the Reverend Matthew Baugh.
Hello. Brian asked me to talk a little about what Halloween is and where it comes from. What it is fairly simple. If you live in North America, you've likely experienced it. There are the decorations, the sales, the movie marathons, the trick-or-treating, the parties, and the thrill and the experience of dressing up as someone else. The delicious, spooky feeling of the season. It is many people's favorite holiday. But where does it come from? Where do all the ghosts and cobwebs and werewolves and other things that go bump in the night, where do they fit into this beloved holiday? Well, the answer is fairly complicated because there are a lot of things, a lot of elements that go into Halloween, and they come from a number of places. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to try to work my way through one at a time, and then you can judge for yourself where Halloween comes from. First, let's take the name. That one is fairly straightforward. Halloween, the word, has a distinctly Christian origin. Halloween is from the Middle English, and it's a contraction of All Hallows Even, or All Hallows In, and it translates into modern English as the eve of All Hallows Day or All Saints Day, which is a Christian celebration that goes back until back as far as the 400s AD. As for the date of October 31st, that one's a little trickier. It kind of comes from a very old Celtic festival that is known in Ireland and Scotland as Samhain. If that name isn't familiar to you, it's probably because, like me, you've seen it written and not seen it, not heard it said. And I've for years and years and years thought it was Samhain. In fact, the real Ghostbusters cartoon told me it was Samhain, and I thought they were an unimpeachable source. So, wisdom came late in life to me. Well, Samhain is a festival. It's one of 4 Celtic festivals that occur annually, and it was the one that represented the beginning of the season of winter. And it came around November 1st, but one thing to realize is that the ancient Celtic peoples didn't use the Julian calendar. They didn't use the calendar that we have, which is a solar calendar. They used a lunar calendar, and the cycles of the lunar calendar and the solar calendar don't line up terribly well. And so holidays that come off the lunar calendar, they tend to bounce around a lot. So according to our calendar, Samhain could have been anywhere from mid-October to mid-November, but it was around November 1st. And when the Julian calendar was finally accepted in Ireland and Scotland, and I was not able to find when exactly that was, but they standardized Samhain to November 1st. Now that's a likely explanation, because the Christian tradition of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, they had not been fixed to a single date for a long period of time. The All Saints' Day, when it started out, and it started fairly early, it started in the 3rd or 4th century AD, it was a day to remember all those people who in the previous year had died for the sake of their faith, in other words, the martyrs. All Saints' Day was celebrated in some places the Sunday after Easter, in some places the Sunday after Pentecost, and it was mostly a spring or summer day of prayer and devotion to those who had died. All Souls' Day, similarly, was sometime in the Easter season. It wasn't for some time until those became standardized. And they became standardized, and this really kind of took effect mostly in the Mediterranean areas, the parts that had been very much the old Roman Empire. And this came about in 609 or 610, when Pope Boniface IV said that All Saints' Day was May 13th, which is not, we don't know exactly why. The presenting argument is that was to celebrate the commemoration of an old Roman pagan temple. It was reconsecrated as a Christian church. There's some speculation that it might have been to coincide with a Roman pagan festival called Lemuria, which is the day that the head of the household has to appease the spirits of the dead, or else they'll be around the house creating mischief for the next year. And so he has to get up early and put on his clothing backwards and march backwards through the house chanting and throwing beans over his shoulder. The idea is that the ghosts, which were called lemurs or larvae, will eat the beans and be satisfied and go back down to the underworld. Or if they're not satisfied, then the whole household can get up and rattle pots and pans and make as much noise as possible. See, ghosts like beans, but they hate noise. It wasn't until sometime later, and we don't know again exactly the reasons. There are a couple of reasons given in Christian records that have to do with the dedication of a church or a special conference that was held. But Pope Gregory III, in either 731 or 741, you can see how shaky the records are there, declared that All Saints' Day would be November 1st. And at that point, it seems to have synced up with Samhain. Whether that was to try to get rid of the vestiges of pagan religion in Ireland and Scotland is a matter of scholarly debate. James Fraser, who wrote The Golden Bough, thought it definitely was. Several others who've come along since have argued that no, it was not. That and when you look at the calendar, Ireland had become Christian in the early 5th century, and so Samhain had basically been around in the British Isles under Christianity for 300 years before this happened. It seems like they would have tried, if they'd been very concerned about repressing it, they might have tried sooner. So it might be, it might not be. It's a shame we don't have the evidence to say for certain, but at this distance, all we can really do is speculate. Now, one of the first things you think of when you think of Halloween are ghosts. And the spirits of the dead are there in everything that came before. They're there in the Roman festival of Lemuria. They're there in the Christian All Saints' Day. They're there in the Christian All Souls' Day. And it looks like they're there in Samhain. There are two epic poems that come from Ireland in the 7th century. One is called the Tain Boculain, which was the Cooley's cattle raid, and the other are the boyhood deeds of Finn. And in both of them, Samhain is mentioned, and Samhain is mentioned at a time when the fairy mounds. There are these large earthen mounds. They're very, very old burial mounds that you find, especially in Ireland, and they're associated with both the land of the dead and the land of the fairies. And there are certain times of day and there are certain times of year, and Samhain seems to be one of these, when the barriers between the world of the living and the world of the dead grow very thin, and the dead can come out and mingle with the living. So the idea of ghosts being connected to Samhain and that passing on somehow to Halloween seems to be a very logical assumption. So what was ancient Samhain like? Well, it was a day when you would end the day with a grand feast. Before that, there was often harvesting in the fields to be done. Now, there is an Irish figure called the Cailleach, which I'm probably not pronouncing quite right, but she was an old woman, and she probably at one point had been a weather goddess. She was believed at this time of year to turn into a hare, and the farmers, as they were harvesting their fields, and when they came to the end of one field, they'd raise a great shout to try to drive the hare off into the next field, because if you got the Cailleach to go from field to field, you would have a good harvest. We don't know much more about the celebration than this. We do, as I said, have the record of the idea of ghosts appearing at Samhain. And there's some thought that maybe the ghosts of dear departed ones would come and join you at the feast as your guests, while the ghosts of those who had been murdered might be lurking around that evening for a chance at revenge. In any case, ghosts are something that go far, far back in both or at least spirits of the dead are something that go far, far back in both the Celtic and the Christian tradition. What about skeletons? Well, skeletons show up more on the Christian side than the Celtic. Skeletons, as a part of the remembrance of the dead, go back to a tradition called memento mori. It's not clear whether this decision started among Jews and Christians or started among Greek and Roman philosophers, but it's certainly something that permeated late Roman and early European society. And the idea was you would take something, a skeleton or a skull, and you would say to another person, memento mori, which means remember that you are mortal. This took a much more specific form in the 14th century. That's the year when we got the Black Plague, killing off just about a third of the population of Europe. And so death became a terrible, omnipresent reality in a way that modern people have not experienced it. And one of the ways they coped is they saw kind of a positive side to this, and you would see pictures drawn that are called the Danse Macabre, or the Dance of the Dead. And in these pictures, you'll have rings of people dancing hand in hand. Some of the people will be living, and some of the people will be skeletons. All of the people, real and skeletons, will be dressed in various costumes. They'll look like soldiers, they'll look like nobles, they'll look like peasants, they'll look like knights, they'll look like clergy. And the message of the Danse Macabre is very simple. Death is the great equalizer. When it comes to death, all people, no matter what their status, no matter what their education, no matter what their wealth, no matter what their power in this world, are all reduced to complete equality. This is something that you can see very strongly in the skeleton decorations, and it takes on an even more special form in Mexico. In Mexico and in other places where Mexicans have immigrated, we have Los Dios de los Muertos, the Days of the Dead. Those cover Halloween, they cover All Saints' Day, they cover All Souls' Day, and the costumes, which focus on skeletons, and the candy, which is little sugar cubes which have been shaped into skulls, are just amazing to look at. Dia de los Muertos is it's different. Halloween tends to have kind of a spooky tone or a somber tone. Dias de los Muertos is pure celebration and fun. There's been recently some discussion that Dias de los Muertos might owe as much or more to the indigenous religions of Mexico, from the Aztecs and the Mayas, than it does to Christianity. But unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any documentation on that. One of the problems with trying to look at old Mexican traditions is we don't have any written records until we get the conquistadores and the priests who, it wasn't always in what they assumed were their interests to record things accurately. So that the possible indigenous origins of Dia de los Muertos, we'll have to look forward to the developing scholarship on that. So we've dealt with ghosts and skeletons, and that leaves us with a number of other creatures of the night. There's the bat, and bats have often been seen as kind of unnatural because they fly like birds, but they have no feathers, and they only come out at night, and they're just kind of weird as far as the average person who goes looking at them says. And there's one other thing. There's a legend of evil spirits who drink blood. This goes back in Europe to classical Greek times. Sturgis and Lemures and Vardalax, or to use the most common word, vampires. In the 1600s, Spanish and Portuguese explorers in the New World discovered a kind of bat that, instead of eating fruit or meat, well, actually it did eat fruit, they just didn't realize that, but it subsisted largely off of drinking the blood of animals. And if you read some of the accounts of the conquistadores, you would guess that cattle and sheep and llamas and other livestock were drained of their blood and left for dead by tiny creatures about that big. Actually, vampires make a very nice, distinct cut with their very sharp teeth, and they lap up the little bit of blood that flows and leave the animal pretty much unharmed and maybe even unaware that it's been fed on. But the discovery of a blood-drinking animal captured their imaginations and became linked to these legends. I think the first time it is explicitly linked, and the first time vampires become popular enough that people start dressing at them as Halloween, has to do with the publication of a 19th century novel by Bram Stoker called Dracula. Similarly, while the werewolf myth has also been around to classical Greek times, werewolves weren't a terribly popular monster, not until 1941, when Universal Studios released a movie called The Wolfman with Lon Chaney Jr., which really made the werewolf a popular and entertaining monster and a popular costume as well. Trick or treat is one of those that it's hard to figure out when that started. There is a tradition, an old tradition, although we don't know how old because we can only trace it back to about the 1600s in Scotland and Ireland. It's called guising or souling, and the idea is that you put on a costume, and the old costumes were very simple. You basically made yourself look like a human scarecrow, and you would go from house to house. Children would often perform. They would recite memorized poems or memorized verses of scripture in return for candy or something called a soul cake, which was baked in Christian households and given out, or possibly even money. At some point, the tradition came that if people didn't give you your treat, you gave them a trick. This came over with waves of migrants to the Americas, and the trick part in this country, in Canada and in the United States, became very popular. And there were lots of things like porch doors and gates and wagon wheels that were stolen, removed from the homes and left on Main Street by pranksters. So the treat part is fairly modern, and the trick part is also responsible for the creation of haunted houses. Haunted houses began in the Great Depression as a way to keep trick-or-treaters off the streets. It was supposed to be a safe, fun, family-friendly way of celebrating. And so you had, very much as you have today, houses with elaborate decorations, actors in costumes, and you get a good, nice, thrilling scare as you go through them. They started simply. They still exist. These days, there are haunted hospitals, haunted prisons, all kinds of variety and often Hollywood quality makeup and special effects. This inspired what I consider to be the strangest and in some ways most disturbing Halloween innovation of all, which was the Hell House in the 1970s, inspired by Jack Chick books. Jack Chick was a cartoonist who wrote a number of Christian comic books, one of which detailed all the sins of Halloween, which was the birthday of the devil, and was a time when pagan people would kidnap children to use them for human sacrifice and all sorts of other nonsense like that. Motivated by the threat of Halloween, some conservative churches across the country, across the United States and Canada, began hosting what they called hell houses. And the name kind of suggests what these were. They were an alternative to a haunted house where you would go in and you would see actors and you'd see sets decorated, and the sets would, there would be sort of a two-part tableau. The first part, you would go in and you would see young people who were obviously considering alcohol or drugs or premarital sex or an abortion or becoming homosexual or various other things like that. You'd move on to the next room and you get a picture of those same young people now suffering the torments of hell, where haunted houses were meant to give you a delicious thrill of fear. These were meant to give you a traumatic sort of fear that would hopefully frighten you into a more righteous way of living than the theoretically depraved sort of life that you might have been living beforehand. They're still around, I'm sorry to say. I hope there's some legitimate value to them that someone has found, but of course, in the latter part of the 20th century, costumes, decorations, animatronics have all taken on a life of their own as sophisticated commercial costumes and makeup have become available. And these days, you can, with a little money, you can make yourself up as anything from one of the Walking Dead to a werewolf to a superhero to a fairy princess to so many other things. As I mentioned before, there's a kind of fun that comes, a kind of release that comes when you put together an identity that's not who you usually or really are. There's a kind of freedom that seems to come with that. So, what are the origins of Halloween? Well, there are some Christian elements. There are some pagan elements, especially Celtic elements, but also Roman and South European and Irish. There are also secular elements, especially commercial elements. So, what's the origin of Halloween? I'm not sure we can say it has one, but as we celebrate it with its many diverse origins, I hope all of you do so safely and have a lot of fun.
We had quite a time getting this segment from point A to point B, and I want to thank Matthew both for taking the time to record that for us and for persevering through all the obstacles that tried to keep us from it. I hope you guys enjoyed Matthew's presentation as much as I did. Well, I wanted to contribute something to this episode besides my usual fare. And with all the Lovecraft nods, I figured I would stay within those classic parameters and do a reading/recitation from a gentleman who embodies Gothic horror. Now, at one time, I had this entire piece committed to memory, and I recited it to impress my wife while we were still dating. But truth be told, that's been 25 years ago, and I had simply forgotten a lot of it. So forgive me if I don't get every word exactly right, but here is my presentation of The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I wandered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered. "Tapping at my chamber door, only this, nothing more." Oh, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, and vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden, the angels named Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor, entreating entrance at my chamber door. some late visitor, entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more. Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. Sir, said I, or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, when so gently you came tapping, and so faintly you came rapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore? This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon I heard a rapping somewhat louder than before. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, nothing more. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven from the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a second stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched and sat upon the bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat, nothing more. Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, through the stern and grave decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art short no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marvel this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore, for we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird upon his chamber door, bird or beast upon his chamber door with such a name as nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only this one word, as if in his soul, in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther then he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken. Doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, until his hopes one burden bore, till the dirges of his hopes that melancholy burden bore of never, nevermore. But the raven, still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining with my head at ease, reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining that the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press Nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed by some unseen censer, swung by seraphim, whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempest sent or whether tempter sent thee here ashore. Desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, in this home by horror haunted. Tell me, truly I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within that distant Aden it shall clasp a sainted maiden that the angels named Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of the lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart and thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul, from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore. So there you have it. It can be hard to follow sometimes with the old writers, in their poetry and their short stories and the way they wrote and spoke. But I found if someone can give the right kind of reading, voice inflection, and word emphasis, that can help clarify where a lot of these things are coming from and what they mean. Hopefully I succeeded at least a little in that tonight, and Mr. Poe didn't too much spin in his grave. Well, it's been a hell of an evening, and I hope that you've enjoyed yourself. I feel like with the weapons demonstrations, the narrations, and our musical number, this episode kind of became a Halloween variety show, and I am 100% okay with that. I hope you're okay with it too. Until next time, you can find us on the web at werewolfhunter.com. Drop me a line at brian@werewolfhunter.com. Thanks for stopping by tonight, and we'll see you in November. But between now and then, I wish you a happy Halloween, happy hunting, and mind the moon.